I remember the first time I saw one of the posters created in the style of FDR's New Deal Work Progress Administration, or WPA. My family and I were visiting Mammoth Cave National Park not far from our then home near Kentucky and Tennessee border. We had taken a day trip to the park and did one of the brief self-guided tours into the cave. The poster with striking orange, greens, and yellows sat in the gift shop like a link to visitors who came to the park in a bygone era. I immediately bought it. Not that long after, I spotted a similarly styled poster at a different park and decided that these posters were the perfect way to showcase which parks or monuments we had visited. Their bright colors gave me feelings of nostalgia paired with memories of enjoying these spaces as a family. Just like the park cancellation stamps I had been collecting at each stop, I became a little obsessed with the whole idea. That probably doesn't come as a galloping surprise for anyone who regularly listens to this show. My obsession was nowhere near that of today's guest, the man behind the modern magic of these posters. Doug Leen, aka Ranger Doug, stumbled his way into the WPA poster chase in the early 1970s while working as a seasonal ranger at Jenny Lake in the Grand Tetons. There, he found a dusty old WPA poster inviting visitors to visit the Jenny Lake Ranger. As we'll hear today, that find sparked a lifetime of hunting for and reproducing a collection of posters created in this series during the 1930s, paired with creating new posters for other parks, like the one I found for Mammoth Cave. As a longtime fan of Ranger Doug, I am delighted to introduce you to him today while we chat about the exciting treasure hunt for the WPA's park posters, while preserving and connecting through art with park enthusiasts of the past is important, and how we can work together to preserve the pieces of history on and through our public lands. Ranger Doug, welcome to Humans Outside.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Oh, I am so excited to talk to you today. As I mentioned, I am a longtime fan and collector. I know you get that a lot. You get a lot of emails that say that, you told me. But man, what a delight to get to talk to you today.
It's fun to be here, except I'm somewhere else.
Yes, well, yes. So we do like to start our episodes imagining as if we are, in fact, together, not me in Alaska and you in where you said you are, Wyoming today. So if we were going to hang out outside in a place that you really enjoy, where would we be with you today?
Well, I'm in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. It's a place I stumbled into, kind of like you did with the posters. Actually, I stumbled into Jackson Hole and the posters almost the same time. But I've been here, 50 years now visiting, and kind of a part-time resident of the valley here. I think I've been here every year now since 1967. And I built a house here and, of course, became a ranger, and I've never been able to leave for very long, let's put it that way.
You have, at least in the past, spent part of your year up here in Alaska. Do you still do that?
Yeah, I have a summer home. I've been there for 20 years up in the southeast section next to Petersburg it's the smallest town in Alaska called Kupreanof. And there's 23 people that live there, 22 right now because I'm down in Jackson Hole. But I keep a summer cabin there. It's a one-room log cabin, but it's kind of a classic old log home on a point with a gorgeous view. I just fell in love with that too, so that's where I spend my summers.
Yeah, can't beat that. So how did you become someone who likes to go outside? How did this become part of who you are? Tell us your outdoor story.
Well, it's probably the other way around. My mama could never get me to come inside, at the end of the day. It's always been a camper, a Boy Scout. When I was in high school, we all climbed mountains because we lived near Seattle within an hour's reach of the North Cascades and the big volcanoes. I worked on the Camp Sherman project on Mount Rainier. It was a kind of a Boy Scout volunteer thing where they built a halfway house up at the 10,000 foot level, just below 10,000 feet. So for 2 summers, I carried 2x4s and buckets of tar and you name it to make this cabin come together. There were probably 10 or 15 of us at any one time. But I spent 2 summers doing that. I met some of the best mountaineers at the time. This is back in the early 1960s. And Omi Diber taught me how to use an ice axe. And from there, worked in Olympic National Park for a summer in 1969, the year that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, and taught inner city kids how to climb mountains. And that was quite a learning experience. My mother's uncle was the founder of Abercrombie and Fitch, the sporting goods company, back in 1893. And that was then completely different than the company it is today. It was outdoors, and they outfitted all the major expeditions of the world. I mean, from Amelia Earhart to JFK, Teddy Roosevelt, you name it. So that's kind of in my blood, I guess. And then later I worked for Eddie Bauer for a couple of years, redesigning some of their down products, tents. We experimented with a lot of stuff. This was in 1970 for a couple of off seasons when I started working for the Park Service.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm about to ask you about another job you held, which is none of the things you just mentioned. We're going to talk about we're going to talk about the WPA and the lost art today. But your longtime professional career wasn't in parks as a ranger or in treasure hunting or in any of the things you just mentioned. It was in dentistry. You've lived in some extremely wild places through that. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, dentistry is it's underrated. People, it's always been joked. It's always a butt of jokes and Doonesbury and this kind of thing. But, it's an incredible profession. You have a skill you can take anywhere on the planet and put it to good use. And I did almost 40 years of dentistry. I'm retired now. About half of that was in private practice, but it was in the public market in Seattle, Pike Place Market. And it was kind of an inner city, frontline ghetto. They were rebuilding the whole area. They had a $62 million grant to rebuild the market. Initially, they were going to tear it down. I thought, what a neat place to go in and start a dental practice. And it was kind of an unknown frontier, metaphorically, I guess. But anyway, I loved it there. But it also allowed me to do some, I could budget my time in such a way that I could take a couple of months off. I went to the Marshall Islands and volunteered on a 3-masted schooner that I helped build the clinic in Seattle, and then we sailed it down to the Marshall. I didn't go on that leg of it, but I met the boat down there, and I was the first dentist to run the program. And we went to all the outer islands and inside the lagoons, anchored for a week, and then did dentistry and medicine. And of course, I went to the South Pole as a dentist with the Antarctica program, and gosh, I'm trying to think where else.
Well, up here into Alaska, that's why, right? That's why you came up here originally, was to dentistry in some of the villages.
I started in Barrow and worked my way south.
Yeah.
And lived on a tugboat for several years and ran around in the backwaters of Alaska pulling teeth. A lot of fun.
I gave a little bit of information background at the beginning on your WPA poster pursuit, but I'm hoping maybe you can give us a more full version. How did you go from stumbling on this dusty poster for Jenny Lake during your time as a seasonal ranger up there to becoming Ranger Doug, Ranger of the Lost Art, which I have to say is a great title?
That phrase popped into my head. It's no secret that it's bad play on words, I guess, but it has a lot of similarities. And I found this poster, and I immediately realized there were probably several copies. It was a silk screen, and they're always made multiple copies. And secondly, there must have been other parks. And we were cleaning out this old barn in the park after the tourists left. We'd kind of clean up the park. It was always a mess. And so my job was to clean out this barn with my boss, and everything was going to the park dump. So I took this poster that was hanging up on the inside of the barn for probably 30 years, since the 1930s, and dusted it off, took it outside, and I said, this is not going to the dump. So I put it in my cabin for the 7 years that I worked there, and then took it back to college when I went back into the dental program. And 20 years later, my boss's wife called up. She ran the bookstore in the park, and she said, we're doing a poster on this historic building called the Jenny Lake Museum, which you worked in for 7 years, and we want to move it over the moraine because it was right on the shoreline. They wanted to, it's an ecological move, to move it off the shoreline, basically. And she said, do you have any idea for a poster? And I said, do I have an idea for the poster? I've got the poster. And I sent her a copy of this thing. And the first thing she said was, well, can you mail it down to us and we can make a copy of it? And I said, no, it'll end up in the dump, because I knew how the park threw things away and lost things. And so I said, let me do the printing up here. It's where all the heavy lifting is in Seattle. And we have printers up there and all the technology. And Moose, Wyoming didn't have too many silkscreen printers at the time. So we made copies of this thing and sold, I think, 600 in 2 years. And then Charlene didn't want to, she said, well, we kind of done this. We're not going to make any more of them. And I said, oh, come on, these will sell forever. I mean, they're beautiful pieces of work. And I said, why don't I make up a Yellowstone one that looks like this same period? And we'll sell the two together because Teton Park and Yellowstone Park are joined. So she kind of acquiesced, and I started snooping around and couldn't find anything. I called the Library of Congress, and finally I made up my own print, hired an artist, and we sat down together and made up an old-timey 1930 print with Yellowstone, the geyser. And then before I printed it, I thought I'd better make one more look. So Charlene said, well, these are government posters. You're not going to find them in the Library of Congress. You're going to find them at the Harpers Ferry Center in West Virginia. If there's anything, that's where it'll be. And she turned out to be right and wrong both. And I did call the Harpers Ferry Center, and they had 13 black and white photographs of a whole bunch of old posters that were done in the 30s. The fellow I was talking to was Tom Durant, terrific fellow. And I said, Tom, is there one in these negatives? Do you have a picture of the Grand Teton Park? And he said, yeah. And I said, read what it says on the poster. And he says, it says, meet the Ranger Naturalist at Jenny Lake Museum. So that was the holy grail I'd been looking for. So now I had 13 black and white photos, and I had one original. And so it was a template I used. And coincidentally, in Seattle, I had a patient who was the Northwest Regional Director. And I went to Chuck, who's Odegaard was his name, and I said, can you get these negatives out to Seattle through your archival system? So they sent out two copies, a high density and a low density copy. And from those, I spent 5 years screening, taking apart these black and white photos, one screen at a time. It took me 5 years. I hired artists to do it. Mike Dupill in Seattle was the chief fellow. But basically, from those black and white negatives, I restored the original historic set. There was only 14 prints that were made. There were 35,000 designs made by WPA artists over 8 years, but only 14 of those 35,000 were National Park. And they made 2 million prints, about 50 copies each. And why only 50 copies? Because they were printing on silk. And silk, like silk stockings, got runs in them, and they're not durable. Today we can make thousands of copies because we have nylons and other ballistic nylon type stuff. But anyway, that's the story of how I got started making posters.
Yeah, and those were at the time distributed to advertise the park to Depression-era folks who weren't traveling because of the Depression, and the government thought that it would be a good idea to get outside. Sounds familiar.
Yep.
Yeah, and I read in your excellent tabletop book on this that these were typically hung, on bathrooms or just in disposable places. So it's not a terrible surprise that they were then ripped down and chucked out with the trash because they saw their use, and that was that.
No, they were very ephemeral. They were never for sale. They were only to entice people to get out of their houses, get in their cars, drive to the parks, and get out into nature. They were 14 parks, 1,400 prints, we assume. Only 40 survive today. 2 of these parks, Great Smoky Mountains and Wind Cave National Park, there are no surviving posters, only these black and white photos that I worked from.
And you have spent quite a bit of time hunting these down and sleuthing for the originals to really come to this conclusion.
Oh, yeah. I've spent literally, after Charlene's phone call, once I started recoloring them, what happened was I had to make up my own colors. And so this was the unknown. And what colors do you use? And the screens, we had to be, all these grayscales. Well, is the sky and the lake the same blue, or is it a different color, So anyway, I made guesses. Some of them were good, and some of them were not so good. But I printed these things, and then the internet came along, and it's the great equalizer. And people that found these original prints started calling me. I never found the prints by going out and searching for them. The prints always found me through the internet. So people would call and say, hey, I've got a print, but it's a different color. What's going on here? And the first ones to show up were Mount Rainier. There were 6 of them. 6 Mount Rainiers Well, actually, there were two Mount Rainiers, and this fellow brought them over, and they were, of course, different colors. They're on hardboard. They looked just like the Jenny Lake print and size and everything. And we didn't even know the actual size of the print. Each one was different. I thought, well, maybe they made different sizes, but it was parallax in the tilt of the camera. So that was an error we had to fix, and a lot of problems associated with that. But anyway, the Mount Rainier turned up, and then the year later, I asked him if he'd sell me one so I could start building this collection. He said, no, I got 2 kids, and they're both park rangers, and I got to give each one the same one. Each son gets one. I said, well, jokingly, I said, if you find a third one, let me know. And a year later, he called me, and he said, I've got another print. And so I went over to his house, and here's not 3 prints, but 5. And he had taken the frame of this one print, that is the third one that he found, and there were 3 prints inside the frame.
Wow.
And the middle one was pristine, and that's the one I ended up buying. We had it appraised by one fellow out in Philadelphia for $1,800, and I about fell over because they cost 12 cents to make back in the 30s. But I tried to dicker with him. He said, nope. He said, I'm going to donate the money to the park anyway. So I said, okay. So anyway, I bought a poster, and today these prints have been appraised for up to $25,000.
Wow. Since we can't see them, although certainly folks can find a link to your website and all of the information in the podcast show notes, as well as they can look at your recent tabletop book on the posters. But can you maybe describe them for us? Can you describe what these posters look like?
Well, yeah, you have to go back to the period. It was after World War I. There was an incredible amount of unrest in the world. The Soviet Union was created, the revolution. There were a lot of poster art at the time that came out of the Soviet Union. And in fact, it inspired a lot of the Bauhaus school. And I'm not an art historian, but the font in the posters is Bauhaus font. It's a German-style font. It's very popular in America. But there was a lot of worker rebellion in America. The Everett massacres in 1918, I believe. And then you had the Depression hit, and this poster, part of the WPA poster division started making these posters. And, of course, they're all unemployed artists and probably left-leaning, whatever. But they adopted the styles at the time from this Bauhaus school. And so the other thing to consider is that these prints are essentially a stacked set of stencils. There's another tongue twister for you, but there was no gradation in the color between one block and the next. So they're very blocky in color, very bold. They tend to use more subdued colors. I've tended to go more bright with the modern ones that we're doing now with new parks. That's a trend that we've found very successful in making these posters. But, they're very unique. And prior to 1987, which is when Chris DeNoon and Henry Viscero wrote a book called Posters of the WPA. And I went out and bought that book, and they found 1,700 prints that were rumored to be stored in a library in Maryland. And they went up in this tour to the building, and these crates pried them open. It's like King Tut's tomb. And they found 1,700 posters, only 400 known before that. So everybody in this country had forgotten about it. The Library of Congress, I think they had 3 or 4 in their collection. They didn't have very many, or they didn't know what they were. I mean, it's that amazing. So after Chris DeNoon's book in 1987, this began this renaissance. And I went out and bought the book, of course, and it's still in print then, and realized, and I called Chris DeNoon up, and I was going to start printing these black and white photos. And I thought, well, maybe if he's got some originals in these 1,700, he could trump my case. He could start printing these too, and I wanted to print them real bad because I was a park ranger. So I called Chris DeNoon up, and I said, hey, I got a WPA poster that I haven't seen in your book. I said, I think it's WPA. And he said, what's the subject? And I said, it's a national park. And he said, well, the WPA didn't make any national park posters. So even Chris DeNoon did not know the extent of the WPA's reach out to public agencies, in this case, the National Park Service itself. Nobody knew these things were there. And so I realized I'm going to spend whatever time it takes to find the rest of these prints. And the bigger scope is that 2 million prints were made in these 8 years, and only 2,000 have ever been found. That's 1/10 of 1%. So that, if you flip the inverse of that, 99.9% of the public poster art that WPA made is gone forever, lost forever. So that's what prompted me to, I got to collect these. I got to find these national park prints.
Yeah. I described in the introduction the sort of wonder and connection I felt when I saw the Mammoth Cave poster in the gift shop. Do you hear that from other people who become collectors? And what is it about these that sparks that, do you think? Why do people like them?
Well, you have to ask them. I like them. You know, I sat in bookstores in the parks and I've watched people shop. And it's good. It's a good lesson to learn. I'm a dentist, and probably not good marketing people anyway. But but I watch people how they shop, and they need to understand the history of these. But nobody kind of knows what the New Deal is, and all this alphabet soup of public agencies, the WPA, PWAP, the CCC, which started out as the ECW. I mean, who can keep all this stuff straight anyway? But anyway, once people understand the history of what the New Deal did, they built Hoover Dam, they built the Department of the Interior building, and they made posters. Once they understand that this is a unique set, that other parks were made, they start collecting them, and they want to visit these parks. I produce 60 park silkscreen prints in the same exact style. They're contemporary. 14 are the originals. But people will now call me up, when is the next print coming out? That's the park I want to go to. And people literally shop the parks as we print posters. And, you know, back in the bookstore for a minute, people will come in the door and they'll walk over to the desk and say, where's Ranger Doug's print? And a lot of other people are making these now for this reason, of course. But we're the only ones in national park bookstores. Right. And we're the only ones that are silk screening. Everybody else is printing on these on-demand printers, and it's not a high-quality print.
Yeah. Your books or notes, I noticed that you haven't personally been to all the parks you printed. Like Mammoth Cave. You hadn't been to Mammoth Cave when the book was printed, and I thought that was funny because that's the one that I liked the most.
That's one of the few I have not been to. I try to visit every park.
Why is preserving this connection with public land visitors and caretakers of the past important? Why is this an important part of the posters and of what you do?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, these posters are historic. And, you know, the National Park Service, when they first were formed, didn't anticipate a depression, of course. You know, they wanted to build a unified system. In 1916, all the parks came together under one roof, so to speak, and standardized uniforms and all this kind of thing. And they, of course, then when the Depression hit, they got money from the government finally. There were senators back in the 20s said not 1 cent for scenery. It's in Doug Brinkley's book. Doug wrote my foreword. And I'll never forget that. It's like, what the heck? It's probably a little too mild, but you know, these posters, unfortunately, were terminated because of the war. There were only 14 made. And you know, what I hope to do with the set is to continue the series as was terminated so abruptly by the war. And it'd be fun to do all 425 park units. We've got a long way to go, and a lot of them are very, very tiny. You might have to amalgamate them together. Pardon the dental pun there, but couldn't resist that. But, you know, I think it'll make people go back and look at how the parks evolved. Mm-hmm. And it happened because of a few great politicians. Teddy Roosevelt, of course. I found a photograph I put in the book of Herbert Collins, who was the portrait artist for the National Park Service when it was first formed. He did the portraits of Horace Albright, Stephen Mather, and the Secretaries of Interior and President of Mexico. He painted the murals at Tumacacri in the southwest at Grand Teton, painted the teepee village in the Kohler Bay Museum today. They painted the mythology of Devil's Tower, the bear scratching the rock to make it the columns look. It's an Indian legend. He painted that. And here he is standing on the steps with Fridtjof Fryxell, who was first park ranger in Grand Teton. And it was his ideas of the glacier moraine diorama that they used as the idea for the Grand Teton poster. It was the first one made, by the way, the Grand Teton print. So they brought Fryxell out to Berkeley when they got all this federal money, they assembled all the great minds at the time. So here's Strixell, Herbert Collins, and the third guy standing with him is William Henry Jackson of the 1872 Hayden Survey. He was with Thomas Moran, who painted the parks, and Jackson took the photographs of Yellowstone and then went to Congress and created the first national park. So here we are, 1934, standing on the steps of an old broken down bank building that went belly up because the capitalists were greedy, and they've stuffed it with government paid artists, and they made beautiful things for one decade. It was incredible. So this history, it's all welded together. There's really a second book here. And the Library of Congress actually has called me and wants me to do it. I'm not so sure I will, but what the park made in this decade is just precious. And up until even last year, the guy that ran the program at Western Museum Laboratory was Ansel Hall, and he was former chief naturalist at Yosemite. And then they made him chief naturalist of the entire Park Service. And then when the federal money came in 1933 and 34, right after when FDR took over, Arno Kammer became the director, and of course he put Ansel Hall in charge of the Western Museum Laboratories, this place in Berkeley where they built all this stuff. And it was Hall that built maps up in Yosemite in his tenure there a decade before that. And all these maps were thrown away last year. And I called the park up, and I was there to get them. And they're now stored. They're in an Air Force hangar in Merced, California. And I'm trying to, like the posters, which are simple, these maps, one of them's 40 feet long, comes in 16 sections. Yeah, 16 sections. So these maps, it's the next book, if you will. And the dioramas, where did they go? The Teton diorama took 3 years to build. Actually, it took 5 years to build, but they worked on it for 3 years. A guy named Lorenzo Moffett drove a Model T Ford 1,000 miles out to the Tetons, skied 18 miles to measure the spot, took some photographs, and then went back and they built the diorama, delivered it, and in 1973 it was cut in half with a chainsaw and taken to the park dump. I wasn't there to save it.
What is the best way for people to continue to help really preserve this kind of history, other than watching their attics and whatnot for the two missing posters, which I know you're still hoping to find? But more broadly, what is the best way for people to preserve this stuff, to really be advocating for that?
Well, first they have to visit parks. I mean, they have to know they have to know what's out there, and many people never get out of the cities. These kids that I taught in Olympic Park back in 1969, these inner city kids, none of them had ever been to a national park. So we have to get into our parks. 2 is we have to vote. We have to vote for people, and we have to vote for the people that are going to support our public lands. And there's a huge schism today between people that think they can kind of walk anywhere they want on land without any regulation. It's not true. I mean, these lands are purchased with public funds and for public use. And we look at Alaska. I mean, 60-70% of Alaska is still owned by the federal government. So what? Do the 750 people that live there today get to run rampant over these lands? No. We do have regulations, and we have stipulations about what lands are for what purpose, and it's doled out, I think, fairly. But we need to educate our legislators. And I'm going to be going to Washington, D.C. in about a month, and I'm going to be meeting with people in the Interior Department. I'm going to be meeting with some congressmen, and I'm going to demand that they fund our national parks fully. I was last in Washington, D.C. I met with Secretary Zinke, and we had a very good talk. And we talked about the $70 carload thing, and he wanted to charge the public $70 a car to get into their national parks. I said, you can't do that. And he said, why not? And he said, Disneyland's $125 or something, ridiculous amount. And I said, because the people already own these parks. They're our parks. And it is America's best idea, Wallace Stegner, borrowed by Ken Burns, and now you hear it today. But, the public lands are owned by the public, pure and simple. But anyway, we need to fund our parks. And I personally think we should be developing our our national parks to their best and get people out into them.
Yeah. Doug, thank you so much for joining us today. If we were going to walk out of this conversation with you, maybe recollecting a favorite moment you have outside, maybe in one of these parks, maybe on one of your adventures, can you describe a moment outside for us that you really enjoyed as we leave this conversation?
Well, oh boy. The one place I think that is most memorable or unique is Antarctica. And I was fortunately, because I was a park ranger, I applied to be a guide to the historic huts in Antarctica. There's, I think, 5 or 6 in the McMurdo Sound area, but 3 principal ones. And I was a guide for this Scott's hut at Cape Evans. And I'd walk out, you drive about 15, 20 miles north of McMurdo on the ice in a big, huge, ugly truck. And it's full of people, like a bus, like a Soviet bus with the 10-foot high tires or something. But we'd get out and walk across, and I'd sit up on the ridge above this cabin. And here's a little tiny cabin. You're looking out over at Cape Royds, which is where Shackleton's hut is, at 6, 7 miles away. And you look at the immensity of this continent you're sitting on, and it's frozen, just incredible. And right to your right, if you're looking down at the hut from this ridge, is Mount Erebus. It's the only continuing erupting volcano in the world, and it's spewing out volcanic ash and other stuff just constantly. And you look out at this vast continent, which is 1,000+ miles across, thousands. And these men 100 years ago, you contemplate these men 100 years ago coming here in a boat. And it was a steam-powered boat, but it had sail. They sailed in, bouncing around off icebergs. And you just imagine what these people were thinking. And what are they crazy or are we crazy? Here we are a century later, in our down coats and our big fancy automobiles and this kind of thing. But to sit up on this ridge and overlook the Shackleton's hut and imagine what went on for years. The heroic age of discovery in Antarctica is just incredible. And that probably is my most memorable outdoor experience.
Well, Ranger Doug, thank you so much for joining us today on Humans Outside. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, hear about this history, hear about the art. Folks can find your book, your tabletop book, on your website, which we will link in the show notes. And it is a beautiful collection of all of the posters and really wonderful storytelling around each of them and the art itself and the park history. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.